This is the fourth in the UN Biodiversity Communications video series titled Story and Story Tools. This video and the next video in the series provide you with the tools and understanding you need to shape the stories and narratives you use in your work in ways that take into account this fast-moving and profoundly different world we've all entered. This first video gives an overview of the central tool and approach that we've been using to identify and analyze the new stories and narratives surrounding UNDP as it intersects with the biodiversity landscape. And at the latter stages of this project, as the COVID-19 crisis has built, layering in the intersection of COVID-19 and the environment movement at this unique moment in history. All these videos alongside the resources are free to use. We simply ask that you acknowledge us when you use them. A more comprehensive set of tools and resources is under development, and we invite you to use these when they're available, which should be in the next few weeks. Guy, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. So just to set the tool in the context of our purpose and why we developed it, we're interested in using story to make change happen faster. And so this tool has been designed to do three things. So one is to use story as strategy and actually to be able to talk about strategy as story. It's for diagnosing and kind of finding the strongest stories for change, those stories that can work as catalyst, and it's also to help people improve their storytelling skills. Why do stories matter? Well, we've been telling them for hundreds of thousands of generations, and in fact, they have been the primary method of communication for much of our time. And so we have developed pattern-seeking, narrative-hungry story brains. We're sort of hardwired. Our neurology and biochemistry responds to stronger stories. Stories have a unique role with narratives, and just want to explore this very quickly to make sure we're kind of clear on the use of the terminology. So a narrative is a big overarching idea. And within coronavirus or COVID-19, there are lots and lots of different narratives. A very early one, very clear one was washing hands stops the spread. And then you can see how that narrative is brought to life and supported and established by lots and lots of different stories, ranging from singing happy birthday whilst you wash your hands through to the pepper test carried out in schools to explain coronavirus to children. Again, with climate, lots of narratives exist. If we think back to April and July, that period last year, a very strong narrative was act now to stop breakdown. And you can see this being sort of supported through stories such as the IPCC's framing of their most recent report, we only have 12 years to act, through to the XR, Extinction Rebellion demands, and through to actors such as like Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, declaring businesses need to change or die. All of those kind of played into driving that narrative forward. How do you use stories to make change happen? Well, there's 5 clear steps that we need to kind of take. The first one is to understand that we're all telling ourselves stories the whole time. And the only thing that can replace a story that we tell ourselves is a better story. Second, that actually it takes many better stories to change a narrative. Third, that if we use the story patterns that we're hardwired for, we'll instinctively understand and adopt the story. Fourth, that stories should be used to bring to life a change, an inner emotional change of attitudes, and they should use an outer journey to do that. And fifth, stories are living, messy things, and they need to keep moving and evolving, but you need to do so in a way that keeps people feeling in control of the story's message. In this presentation, we're just going to look at the first 3. And the first one, thinking about stories and being replaced with better stories. If you look at the last sort of 60, 70 years of the stories around space, you can sort of track high points where clearly JFK and the mission to get a man onto the moon and back was a better story. You saw low points where that story wasn't being updated, it wasn't being sort of replaced. And we find ourselves now where Elon Musk and sort of SpaceX have again created a better story for space, and for that reason it's now sort of captured the public and society's imagination. If we think about climate, you can sort of see over the last 18 months how when we've started to align many stories, we get to the second point, which is the alignment of thousands of them is where we start to change narratives. This third step about using patterns, we have put a pattern at the heart of our tool. That pattern is called the hero's journey. It was identified in around 1940s by an academic called Joseph Campbell, who looked at 40,000 of the world's most successful stories. So Greek myths, religious texts, Victorian penny dreadfuls, Aboriginal legends, etc. And what he was interested in is finding patterns in the underlying structure of the world's most successful stories. And he did find a single pattern to that structure. And it's called the hero's journey. Within it, there are 17 different stages. We have worked with these over the last decade and have focused on 9, which are absolutely critical for stories about change. And I'm going to talk through each of these 9. To talk through them, I'm going to use an example from Hollywood. So as a spoiler alert, it is the pattern behind the world's most sort of successful and popular films. And actually, George Lucas was a student in the 70s of Joseph Campbell, the originator of the pattern, and he picked it up and applied it to his screenplay, Star Wars. Other popular films all fit the pattern, and it's not just a pattern that you can see in Western popular culture, but actually the highest grossing films in India, Dangal, but also Wandering Earth in China also fit this pattern, which is why it's useful for us to think about using. It also is used in the most successful stories about change in society. So whether that's Silent Spring or Green Belt movement, they both fit the patterns. It's not just about movement, it's also about successful businesses and I guess the kind of grassroots social and environmental justice campaigning that we've kind of seen in more recent years. So I'm just going to introduce these 9 building blocks, and I'm going to use Star Wars to just illustrate the really important points for each step. So Star Wars is set in space. None of us have been to space, but we need to be drawn into the film. So we're given a character, and we're given a character who has universal but distinctive attributes that we can relate to, and it drives the empathy. So Luke is a bored teenager, and we all know what it's like to be a bored teenager. So that pulls us straight into the story. Luke's setup also is around empathy building. It's a very ordinary world. So he's bored because he works on a moisture farm on a desert planet. But there is a niggling frustration, and this is this idea about an oppressive galactic empire being in the background, making life not as nice as it should be. Those frustrations aren't enough to trigger a person to go on a journey of change. We need them manifested in a more compelling villain. The really key thing here is that where it is personified within films, and the temptation is to do that in real life, actually the most interesting and useful villains are those that represent an attitude or a behavior that we wish to overcome and defeat.
Guy, if you could just move your screen slightly, the sun's come round and is causing a bit of glare.
Thanks, Ben.
Perfect.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We also need a trigger to start the journey. And in films, you kind of see this very often as either a push, so someone has to act out of necessity, or it's a pull, it's an opportunity that draws us towards adventure. And in Star Wars, one of those is the request to kind of help save someone. We then need a point of commitment, a crossing of a threshold where there is no return. And this is really important because if we're going to be invested in this person and their journey, we want to really, really kind of make sure that they're kind of committed to it. Now, this is an everyday person that's looking to make a big change and defeat a tough villain. And so therefore, we're not really expecting them to do it without help. So the allies are of critical importance. In the context of Star Wars, if the challenge for the hero is to get on to a Death Star and fly away from it, it's very helpful, for example, that one of his allies is a smuggler and also a pilot with a very fast ship. Mentor is slightly different from their ally, mainly in the sense that they represent someone who has already been on this journey or a very similar journey beforehand, and it's their experience and wisdom which is going to help us and help the audience believe that the journey and the change will be successful. Here is the meat of the story. It's 3 challenges. The key thing about the challenges is that we need to see the journey as a series of obstacles, and we learn something as we successfully overcome each of those obstacles. We also need to be honest about the jeopardy and struggle. It will draw us into the kind of story, but also it's true about real life, and all stories must be true. And then finally, we reach our sort of destination, which is a better world. So humans like circularity. So we need to kind of see a return, if you like. And part of that needs to be not just how the world is better, manifested it in a kind of a physical sense, but also the emotional growth, the emotional change that's happened. And that's, say, for example, why it's really key that Star Wars doesn't end with the destruction of the Death Star, but actually we see a return, and the clues in the name of the film, a return with new hope. So that's an overview of the key steps. And what we will be doing is using that as a framework to analyze and diagnose. And we do that through a kind of a canvas. And then what this allows us to do is better understand stories that don't work in a chronological sense, like a Hollywood film. And what we've kind of left for you here are some sort of clear instructions about what to look for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys. So that's a huge amount of information in a very short period of time. This is designed to be thought about as we move forward through the rest of the videos. It's the framework that we're using to analyze and make sense of the stories that are surrounding supporting UNDP, biodiversity landscape, COVID-19, the environment movement. We realize that that's a very large amount of information in a very short period of time, which is one of the main reasons why we're developing a series of resources which will be available very shortly to allow you to unpack the story canvas, the hero's journey, and the tools that we'll be hearing about in the next video.